All right, good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to all of you who are here attending this event on the theme, The State of Prearranged Financing, Time to Get Ahead. I'm Ekoswehi Yahen, the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum, which is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry, but co-chaired with the United Nations and World Bank Group and other international organizations. This event is jointly being organized with our partners, the Center for Disaster Protection, as well as the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership. So the three institutions coming together to put on this event, and the theme, which could not be more relevant given where we are today in Dubai at COP28, what we're also seeing in terms of the broader developments around loss and damage. Obviously, for our institutions, central in all of this is climate change, as I said. So it's really a pleasure to have the excellent panel that we've been able to convince to join us this afternoon for this discussion. So really thank you to all of you for making the time, and obviously to the audience. So for a little bit of context, we all know that planning and preparing for shocks pays. Prearranged financing for disasters has the potential to significantly increase the predictability, speed, and effectiveness of responses to shocks. The insurance industry, as we know, we know that 55% of crises, from floods to droughts and disease outbreaks, are predictable, and that funding can be arranged in advance and released when it is needed. The unfortunate reality, however, is that prearranged financing is not the traditional way that the world pays for disasters. Despite the momentum that we've seen over the last few years, prearranged financing remains just a small niche component of international crisis financing and climate adaptation and resilience building efforts. Meanwhile, the exposure to risk continues to grow at alarming rates. In November this year, our partners, the Center for Disaster Protection, issued a report on the state of prearranged financing. And personally, I have to say that I knew that the situation was not ideal. But what the report revealed was actually shocking. I will not go into the details because we do have a presentation with one of our colleagues who is online who will provide some insights into the report. But the objective of this session is to provide you with a trusted baseline on the state of prearranged financing, building on the information from the report. I also want to use the opportunity to highlight some practical things that can be taken to address this challenge. Examples of existing initiatives, which perhaps could be scaled. Yes, there are initiatives that might need some refining, etc., but at least to give us a direction that this is not something that we cannot do anything about. It is something that we can tackle. And then the third element of this is really a call to action. It's not just about the speakers who are engaged on these issues on the day-to-day basis. It's also about all of us who are present in this room, right? So that you are aware of the current situation, but also start to reflect, if you are not already doing so, on the things that you can also do within your respective institutions. So the conversation that we will have today, as I said earlier, we will kick off with a presentation from the colleague online, Lydia Poole, who is the Associate Director, Policy and Evidence at the Center for Disaster Protection. And then following that, we will have a conversation amongst the panelists. I will pose some questions. Some of them they haven't seen yet, so we'll see how they react, right, to the questions. And then I'll also open it up to the audience for questions, because I see a number of folks in this room who have been in this field for a very long time, and I will be very curious to also get your perspectives when we open up the discussions later on during this hour. And before I hand over to Lydia, I just want to, of course, introduce the panel so that we have a clear sense of who we have here in the room. We have Eleanor Heavy, who is the Associate Director, Strategy and Engagement at the Center for Disaster Protection. We also have Francis Bouchard, who is the Managing Director, Climate MMC. And I also have to acknowledge Francis, because when I said to him, we need an event on prearranged financing, he said, okay, well, maybe you can have the space that MMC has in the Resilience Hub for this. So thank you, Francis, for giving this the space to have this important conversation. And of course, Leslie Ndlovu, who is the CEO of ARC Limited, who is joining us. Again, an incredible initiative, I think, that's been quite pioneering in this space in many ways. And then finally, Christina Bennett, who is the CEO of START Network. Again, another entity really focused on working with humanitarian actors, and I think also doing some really pioneering space-defining activities. So that's our panel. We don't want a scripted conversation. We want to challenge each other, challenge the audience, and the audience challenge us as well in terms of some of the information that you will hear. And with that, I would like to hand over to Lydia Poole to just run us through the report and some of the findings. Thank you. Do we have Lydia?
Thank you so much. Can I just check that you can see the slides in the room?
No.
Okay. So thank you. It's a real privilege to be able to join you today and to run through some of the findings of our recent report, The State of Prearranged Financing for Disasters, which hopefully is going to frame this panel discussion. We're very lucky to have some of the people who are really at the forefront of this agenda in the room. But first of all, I wanted to say a few quick words about why we produced this report. So for us at the Centre for Disaster Protection, shifting the way that we pay for disasters from the current default, which is an unpredictable, discretionary ex-post financing responses, towards an approach where financing is planned and arranged in advance, this is really central to our mission. But we found that we didn't really know how much prearranged financing there actually was, and therefore how much we might need to improve our performance. And we certainly don't know how much is really needed. And we think it's important that if we're going to achieve something like a substantial scale up, which we hope to do, that we really need to establish some kind of baseline and to be able to monitor our performance against that to see where we're making progress and where we need to do a lot better. So with this report, we set out to try to collate the best available data that we could to try to build up more of a picture of at least how much prearranged financing there was that was being supported by international development financing actors in low and middle income countries. And in this first iteration, we focused on financing for prearranged financing, so it's a bit of a mouthful there, that's supported by international development financing because it's partly a function of the availability of the data, but mostly because this international development financing is a really powerful tool that we have at our direct disposal that can help to create the incentives and enabling conditions and opportunities for low and middle income countries to increase their financial preparedness. So it's something which we as international actors have relatively direct influence over. So if we can move to the first slide, please. Sorry, the next one. So I just wanted to take a moment to very briefly explain what we mean by prearranged financing, because we've got quite a specific definition at the centre. So we are talking about here financing that's been approved in advance of a crisis event and that is guaranteed to be released when a specific trigger or condition is met. And what it is not is a shorthand for only insurance. So within this category, that could include a range of different instruments, such as contingency funds that might have agreed triggers attached to them, contingent loans, anticipatory action frameworks, parametric insurance, catastrophe bonds, quite a wide set of instruments which could be applied to this definition. And I think Ecosway's already set out why we think it's important. We believe that it has a major transformative potential to increase the speed and predictability and effectiveness of responses to crises, and ultimately to really deliver a much more dignified responses that minimise the impacts of shocks on climate and crisis vulnerable people. So next slide, please. So what did we find? Well, that headline news is that prearranged financing is growing, but from a very, very low baseline. So it's increased from 177 million in 2017 to 1.9 billion in 2021. So we're still at this really low level, and it's very far from being the default way in which we pay for crises. So this 2.2%, I should add, is of all of the international development financing that was spent on preventing, preparing for and responding to crises. And that's in this 5-year period of 2017 to 2021. So I think we can probably agree that 2.2% of crisis financing is a pretty low baseline. So there's plenty of room for improvement there. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I found quite shocking when we started to look more deeply into the data was not so much that the overall levels were low. I think we were expecting that, but was really that such a small proportion of pre-arranged financing supported with international development financing was actually reaching low-income countries. So high-income and upper-middle-income countries received 43% of this financing in this 5-year period, and lower middle-income countries 38%, while low-income countries were only receiving 3.7% of the total, and that was 201 million across this whole 5-year period. So Ecosway said the findings of the report were quite shocking. That I think is the finding for many of us that was the most shocking. So why is that the case? Next slide, please. So there are a number of reasons on both the demand and supply side as to why that funding is so heavily concentrated in higher income countries. First of all, to note that multilateral development banks are the major providers of international financing for pre-arranged financing. So they contributed 72% of the total in that 5-year period, with governments and the EU institutions providing a further 27%. So if banks are the major providers, it follows that the majority of international development financing for pre-arranged finances is going to be provided in the form of loans rather than grants. But not only that, we also found that more than half of the international development financing for this was didn't actually qualify as official development assistance or aid. It actually fell within the broader scope of what the OECD DAC calls other official flows. So these are aid-like flows which don't meet the strict definition of ODA, either because their primary purpose is not development or because they're not sufficiently concessional to count as aid. And in the case of pre-arranged financing, these other official flows were mostly loans, and they were loans which weren't sufficiently concessional to count as aid. So that might be the case, for example, where a country doesn't qualify as eligible for the most concessional financing under the rules that multilateral development banks have, because their GNI per capita is above an agreed poverty threshold. So this distribution of pre-arranged financing probably reflects the fact then that a lot of the demand for these contingent loans, which makes up the largest share of pre-arranged financing, is actually coming from higher income countries who are not eligible for the most concessional sorts of loans. So this is probably not surprising if you are a close observer of the field and you know your history, because the instruments that are currently providing the highest levels of financial protection are contingent credit, catastrophe bonds, and these regional risk pools, which we'll hear a lot more about later. And these were all originally developed to meet the needs of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean in the mid to late 2000s. And that region is, of course, comprised of predominantly upper middle income and high income countries. So this concentration of funding in middle income and high income countries is then the logical outcome of where early demand was identified and the types of instruments and financing that were developed to meet that demand. So whilst not surprising in some respects, I think it's still quite a sobering finding for many of us. And so this is really, I think, a crucial moment for us to reflect on whether we think we have the right tools and financing approaches within our toolkit currently to help to carry us through what we hope will be a significant scale up of pre-arranged financing. Next slide, please. So the good news is that we are starting to see some really positive developments and innovations in the toolkit that we have to support pre-arranged financing in low and middle income countries. And this is a really young and innovative field. So it's also able to draw on the expertise of many different technical fields. So internationally supported pre-arranged financing is really at this creative intersection of private finance, risk modelling and development and humanitarian action. So it can draw on this deep technical expertise and this deep context-specific experience of all of these actors. So there is a huge potential to continue to innovate and adapt there. And as you are all acutely aware, being where you are, that pre-arranged financing has now found itself kind of at the heart of a lot of climate policy dialogue as a potential solution to try to address some of the impact of climate-related shocks. And there are some really encouraging areas of progress in specific instruments, which I'll just run through very briefly. So we now have 4 regional risk pools, and there's continuous innovation in their products and offerings, and most notably coming from the Caribbean Risk Pool, CRIF, and also the African Risk Capacity. And the African Risk Capacity, we should also note, is one of the leading providers of pre-arranged financing for low-income countries. The second notable development is that the World Bank, who's the major provider of contingent loans, has now extended this offer to low-income countries and increased the attractiveness of those terms. But I think, as you can probably see on one of the charts here, uptake of those instruments still remains very low, so that we don't have the latest data for 2022 yet. But there are looks to be some real challenges in terms of demand and uptake there. One of the other really notable developments that we've seen is that attitudes towards donor-funded support for premiums to buy risk transfer insurance products, it has changed really rapidly. So 5 years ago, using aid money to bring down the cost of premiums was something that was really considered taboo. And now it's much more widely accepted. And attitudes are continuing to change around that, and the comfort levels of providing perhaps even longer term and more predictable support to countries to buy premiums is starting to shift. And so we saw, for example, that in the 2021-22 African Risk Capacity Risk Pool, 73% of premium income was actually paid for with donor premium support. Another really notable area, encouraging area of growth is in anticipatory action, which is a subcategory of pre-arranged financing that's currently largely delivered by humanitarian actors and largely with grant financing. And the really interesting thing about anticipatory action is that it bucks the trend of wider pre-arranged financing in that it's very heavily concentrated in low-income countries, which hopefully you can see in the pie chart on the slide there. And around 79% of anticipatory action in 2021 was concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected settings. But anticipatory action is still absolutely tiny in scale. So in 2021, it represented just 0.2% of the total humanitarian funding reported to the OECD DAC. And then also, just to place these cautiously positive developments in the toolkit in their wider context, we also need to acknowledge that debt sustainability is a major concern for many low and middle income countries. Also, that the cost of reinsurance have driven up the cost of insurance in recent years. So under these circumstances, pre-arranged financing is a pretty difficult priority for governments. And it's going to need significant support from international actors to help make the terms more attractive. So next slide, please. So despite this somewhat gloomy picture that I've just painted, I wanted to point out some of the key ways that we think that we can start to make some progress here. So if we're going to achieve something like this significant scale up that we're hoping for, in one sense, we have this tremendous moment of opportunity right now. So from the earlier stages of this data in 2017, international development financing for pre-arranged financing was absolutely tiny. It was 0.5% of total crisis financing, and it has grown in that time. And it was very much a niche technical field in those early years and largely located within the World Bank. And from those early beginnings, the political and policy landscape has altered really dramatically in the last few years. So pre-arranged financing has now really been elevated to a key focus of international climate policy and also multilateral reform. So we have this huge moment of possibility, and this increased attention could potentially help us to drive a significant expansion. But right now, as we've seen from the findings of the report, pre-arranged financing is falling significantly short of meeting the needs of the most vulnerable countries and people. And of course, as noted, the affordability of financial protection is a significant constraint. So we need to scale up and fast, given that the incidence of climate-related shocks are increasing rapidly. And we also need to really rapidly adapt the instruments and approaches that we have at our disposal. We also need to make sure that we're actually delivering high-quality pre-arranged financing that is focused on the most vulnerable people, and it's delivering effective and efficient responses. And we think that this act of monitoring the financing is going to be a powerful tool to help to drive some of these changes. So with this report, we hope to provide every year this baseline and trend monitoring to allow us to have some critical reflections on how we're doing. And also we are hoping to provide those who might wish to set targets and to improve the traceability and the quality of the data, an opportunity to engage with us on that through a community of practice. So I'll stop there and hand back to the room and be available for any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lydia, for the excellent presentation. That's also paints a very complex and nuanced picture as it relates to this issue. As was said, for me, the most shocking element was not only the size, how little we're actually doing in terms of prearranged financing, but the fact that for all the discussions that we have about, reaching the most vulnerable, the money isn't actually getting there, right? So there is a real problem that we have on our hands. So I would like to perhaps kickstart the conversation by drawing a bit of attention to what are some of the things that we're actually seeing when we talk about prearranged financing that are innovative, that can give us, as I said, a pointer in terms of how we might want to shift this space. So I'll start with you, Christina, CEO of Start Network, to perhaps tell us a little bit about Start Ready. As I said earlier, I want people to have a sense of the practical, right? So what is Start Ready? And beyond that, what do you think needs to be done, reflecting on the presentation from Lydia, to make the international community and countries also more invested in schemes such as Start Ready and further ex-ante shift that we need to see?
Great, thanks very much, Ekosway, and thanks to Lydia for the presentation. Can you hear me? Okay, great. As Ekosway said, I'm the CEO of Start Network, but I also have the privilege of sitting on the board of both the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership as well as the Center for Disaster Protection. So I'm here with all of my hats on as a speaker, but also as one of the hosts. Anyway, but just to say that Start Network is a membership organization of 100 local, national, and international organizations working across 6 continents. And we need to do this. Okay. And the thing that binds us together is this common frustration about the way that the world reacts to disasters, right? We are too reactive, we're too slow, we miss opportunities to act ahead, and we miss opportunities for communities to really lead what is important to them in terms of the responses. We're also driven by a common concern about some of the statistics that Lydia put up there. We just actually commissioned a report to find out the impact of climate-related hazards on some of our own programs, and that report found that climate-related hazards are going to increase humanitarian spend 10 times by 2030 and 50 times by 2050. And the majority of those humanitarian interventions are going to need to be for small to medium-sized crises. So under the radar of most donors and under the radar of most of those international funds. But in that concern, we're also really excited about the opportunity for scaling up prearranged finance as a way of really changing the behavior of all of our organizations to act ahead as the default response when it comes to low-income countries and humanitarian situations. So you asked me about Start Ready, but I want to paint a picture a little bit of our family of funds that includes filling gaps in anticipatory response through a pooled fund that we have called Start Fund. The Start Fund is a rapid response fund, but increasingly a rapid response fund that allocates ahead of crises. So in its lifetime, it's allocated £127 million in its 10 years of operating. This year, 21% of that money went in anticipation of crises. We also operate Start Ready, which is a pre-positioned financing tool that basically pools funds and pools risks and triggers those funds based on a particular risk triggering in a particular situation. We've got now Start Ready risk models in 11 risk models in 8 countries. As well as parametric insurance to supplement all of that for predictable crises like drought that often result in really large-scale catastrophes. And then just importantly, the way we do all of this is through locally led action. And we believe wholeheartedly that locally led action is the only way to do prearranged finance. It is more effective, it is more contextual, and ultimately it helps to build resilience of communities over the long term. Maybe just a few examples of how we know that this works. I was in Bangladesh in October, where I visited a community that had just recently been literally washed away by a flood. Because we had modeled that risk in 50 communities or so along that riverbank, our local partner there took the communities, worked with them to identify those most at risk, moved them to higher ground, their belongings, their houses, everything, ahead of the flood. And so when the flood came and literally washed away the ground that their houses had been on, they were safe. And when I spoke to the women in that community, they said they had moved 10 times in the last year, and this was the first time that they had been able to actually move their houses, move their cooking utensils, move their beds, move their livestock, and actually restart their lives really, really quickly. Similarly with Start Ready, we know that, for example, the drought insurance that has triggered in places like Senegal, Somalia, and Zimbabwe has helped to stem acute food insecurity, has also helped to promote livelihood support. So we know from the evidence base that we're building that these actually work. You wanted me to say what will get us to prearranged finance. Well, look, we need to obviously scale up the resources. And while Lydia has painted a really good picture of the momentum behind scaling up some of those resources, certainly donors are really understanding now more and more the fact that prearranged finance is better value for money, but it also is more effective, more contextual, and more ethical, and also helps to build resilience in the long term, all things that donors want to see. So we need to scale up that financing, but alongside it, we need to scale up the risks, the risk models, and the countries in which we're operating. And I would say not only to scale those up, but really improve the quality and coordination of those risk models. So, for example, there's a lot of noise in this sector right now. A lot of people sort of doing anticipatory action, doing prearranged financing, some of them to varying degrees of quality. And what we're trying to do at Start Network is to make sure that we coordinate with all of these other actors so we're not stepping all over each other, but we're also speaking from the same song sheet, that we recognize the risks in the same way and act in complementary ways when they trigger. I think I'll stop there because I can see you want me to stop. Go ahead.
So a very comprehensive answer, but I also really appreciated your interventions because it's also about demystifying what we are talking about when we say prearranged financing, right? It is things, I'll be blunt, that make common sense, but we don't do enough of, right? There are examples that we could get, the evidence that has been provided through this report is also to get people who are in charge of the financing, right, to really think carefully about how they spend and how they move that money. So with that, I'll turn over to you, Leslie. We've heard a lot about ARC, but as was said, when we talk about prearranged financing, it's not just insurance, it's a suite of instruments that we're talking about. But I really want to hone in on this issue of catastrophe risk insurance programs and the offer in terms of a potential solution as relates to financial protection gaps that we are seeing for large-scale risks in many countries. As Lydia had pointed out, the ARC is a really great example in where we have been successful in actually providing some level of access to financing for low-income countries, right? So what do you see in terms of where are we, for starters, right, in terms of the ARC program? What do you see in terms of the growth and the opportunity to help us close this deep gap that we're seeing in prearranged financing?
Right. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So maybe I would like just to start the conversation by just emphasizing, I think, some of the points that were raised earlier. First, the reason why prearranged financing is extremely important is that it is far superior to the current approach of waiting for the disaster to happen, then launching a humanitarian appeal, which takes a very long time to mobilize the necessary funding. And of course, by the time the funds arrive, it's too late and the implementation is uncoordinated. So really the problem that we are solving is how we get the money to the people that need it as quickly as possible. And I also like the term prearranged financing, because very often we talk straight about insurance, but insurance doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of an ecosystem, which includes contingency funding, which includes the CAT DDOs that were mentioned earlier. And of course, insurance still has a key role to play. In terms of where we are on the African continent, I mean, the honest answer is that we haven't done enough. We need to acknowledge the progress that has been made, especially at ARC over the past 10 years, but there is more that can be and should be done. If we start by looking at the number of people that are covered, we are currently covering about 50 million people now through our various insurance programs. But we estimate that there are 700 million people on the continent whose lives and livelihoods are at risk of being disrupted by extreme weather events. So the way we think about it then is really how do we scale up our solution from the 50 million people that currently have coverage to the 700 million people that need it. Our approach at ARC is really threefold. Firstly, as you mentioned, we are focusing at the level of the governments, so what we call macro coverage. The way this works is that the government of a particular country takes up insurance. If there is a drought, a flood, or a tropical cyclone, then we pay a claim to the national government, and the national government then organizes the response. The second part of our business is actually the work that we do with my good friend Christina around insurance coverage for humanitarian agencies, because on the African continent, when an extreme weather event happens, the response of the government has to be supplemented by the response of the humanitarian agencies. So we also provide insurance to them, and in fact, we are also happy to be part of the Start Ready program, providing the insurance part. So a drought, a flood, or a tropical cyclone happens, we pay the claim to our humanitarian agency partners, and then this allows them to very quickly and effectively respond. Then the third aspect is around micro and meso insurance, which is insurance that we are providing to small and medium scale farmers. And that in that part of the business, we are working with aggregators, local cooperatives, value chains, seed companies that are able to organize farmers into a collective, and we provide insurance to them. We believe that this approach of working through the various partners and channels actually gives us the greatest opportunity to be able to scale. At ARC, we have grown our coverage 3 to 4 times in the last couple of years as a result of this approach. And then maybe just to conclude on this point, that we are also excited by the loss and damage discussion that is happening, because the subsidization of insurance premiums is also being considered as one of the avenues for the loss and damage fund, which means that there are more people that can afford the product, and in that way, it's also an opportunity to scale up coverage to the vulnerable communities that need it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie, for that. I now want to turn to Francis. Even though, Leslie, you touched on a good point as it relates to the broader conversation around loss and damage. I do have a question for Eleanor with regards to that, but we will get to it. But before that, let's turn to Francis. We heard earlier, talking about insurance ex-ante instruments as rather seen as rather expensive, but also in some instances more of a reactive measure. How do you think, from a private sector perspective, because offering a slightly different view, the industry can better articulate its value to support what we are seeing within this space, right, around ex-ante finance.
Thank you, Ekushwe, and thank you, everybody, for being here, and the panelists. I think it's a great topic. You know, this concept of insurance being expensive is really a signal we're sending, right? So this isn't expensive because we just like to make a lot of money. It's expensive because the likelihood of loss is high, or the uncertainty is high. So the insurance sector could play multiple roles, and not just these issues that we're talking about here, which are very important, but really risk management generally in society. And one of them is risk transfer, and it's critical for us to be able to do that role to really understand the frequency and severity of a risk. And we all know that there are risks out there where you know that. Take automobile insurance, for example, where we have records on millions and millions and millions of automobiles and hours driven and miles driven and individuals, whatnot. So we have massive amounts of data that really can help us determine severity and frequency of a loss. You know, in a lot of these evolving climate-related risks, that's very difficult because we don't tend to underwrite looking forward, we tend to underwrite looking backwards. And without that forward capability to really pinpoint when and how and where a lot of the climate exposure is going to manifest, there's a lot of uncertainty and noise in the system. So the expensive bit of our risk signaling element is really a reflection, I think, of the uncertainty of the exposures that are emerging here. And oftentimes, you know, we go back to something that was said a little bit earlier. You know, the other bit about insurance is the best thing that can happen is that you pay and get nothing back, right? That's the best thing that can happen. But that doesn't sound like a great proposition for a donor or a philanthropy or a government, right? I've been around long enough to know or to recall that, you know, we used to see big storms hitting, you know, smaller nations, poor nations, perhaps in the Pacific or elsewhere, and the insurance industry would wipe its brow and say, whew, well, at least that wasn't insured, all right? We've flipped it now, and now I see, you know, programs that are being put in place that we're upset when it doesn't pay out, right? And that's one, it's a new concept, but it's really a balancing act that I think the insurance industry is still working through in terms of how to make that risk transfer capability accessible, affordable, perhaps, through better data and better modeling. And the reference earlier about the importance of modeling is critical. And I think we're on that journey. And I think some of the work, you know, I'm almost embarrassed to answer this question, Ekushwe, because what you and Kip and so many in this room are doing with the IDF is really kind of bringing that capability to countries in a way that they've never had it before. So just to pick up on the expensive bit, that's a bit of the canary in the coal mine, right? That's sending a signal that there's something happening here that we don't really completely understand, and in order to put money on the table and put capital exposed, it's going to be expensive. But that's not our only role, right? And I do think as an industry, we tend to too often narrow our value proposition to how can we transfer this risk for that price. And I think in today's day and age, it's incumbent on the insurance sector to break out of that thinking, that narrow thinking, because not only in order for us to come up with that price, we do have to do a massive amount of analytical work, a massive amount. And it's not just analytical work that's relevant to us in that ultimate pricing. It could be used by multiple stakeholders. And again, I'm a little bit embarrassed because you guys IDF is leading this effort with, and Nick, you could talk about this for hours with the GRMA and the GRIC rolling in the back. I mean, there are people in this room who have really pioneered this concept of transcending risk transfer and really taking the analytical basis of insurance. And that's really at the core. You know, the kind of the magic sauce we have is the analytics, and then we put a price on it ultimately. But those analytics can be so useful to helping to better inform. Did you want to jump in? You're going to correct me? You certainly could, I'm sure, Ekushwe. But it could better inform disaster risk reduction. It could better inform diversification within governments. It could, I mean, these analytics are incredibly powerful, and I think we're starting to see a lot more recognition that the insurance sector can really help create insurable markets by finding ways to share its knowledge and its analytics and its capabilities. And that's not just a developing world concept, it's also happening in the developed world as well. So I think that that's going to be probably the next wave of value that you'll see from the insurance sector is a deeper understanding of how to share its analytics and make those accessible to others. But there's another role we've also played, but again, echo Shui and IDF are playing this too, and I call it the catalyst role. So, this has happened repeatedly over the past few hundred years where the insurance sector has struggled perhaps with an exposure, with a peril, with a risk, and found non-traditional ways, non-risk transfer ways to help manage it. And I think climate is going to be the next one. I'll give you a few examples. One, probably the best one, since we're a little bit pressed on time, is electricity. So in 1892, not too long ago, there was an expo, actually, in Chicago. And it was going to be the first time that electricity was going to be deployed on a large-scale basis. And before that happened, some insurance company sent an MIT engineer over to Chicago to take a look at this, and he saw, as you can imagine, wires everywhere, wrapped around wood, wrapped around plaster. I mean, it was just literally a disaster waiting to happen. So he ran back or took the train or took a horse, I don't know what, got back to Boston and said, look, this is a real exposure we need to be concerned about. Unlike, I fear, today. So if this was today and this engineer came back and told the insurance sector there's this risk, I fear that the insurance industry would view it as an underwriting factor and either exclude it or price it so high that anybody who wanted to use electricity in their home would not be able to access it. But that's not what they did. Instead, what they did is they realized that electricity was a public safety issue. So they took their analytics, they combined it with a bunch of engineers, and they created an institution called Underwriters Laboratory, which essentially became the world's standard setter for safety measures on electrical appliances. So the insurance sector literally made the world safe for electricity. Now, if we can do that, we can help countries manage their climate exposure, and it probably will not be through risk transfer.
Yes, thank you for that, Francis. Yes, I appreciated your reaction because I was about to challenge you, but anyways, you came back very well. So I think, from my perspective, I think a big part of this is also putting a clearer picture on the price of inaction, right? So when we see the situation that we are currently dealing with in terms of prearranged financing, there is a cost to that. Right? There is a cost to being inefficient. There is a cost to not investing in risk reduction, etc. And I could go on and on forever, right? But Eleanor, we've heard a lot. We are at COP21, in Dubai, lots about loss and damage, etc. But I see this issue as really quite an interesting one because it's a little bit of a bridge, right? It's a bridge between, the humanitarian world, development, and also climate. How are you seeing that nexus in terms of how do we navigate this shift that needs to occur, but also within this space where you have so many different actors and constituencies engaged in it? So over to you.
Thank you. And I think that's actually working okay. I think it's really key, and I think what we've really got to avoid, particularly this year and next, is a kind of further fragmentation of what's been a very kind of complex set of different policy processes and issues. And I think we sit as the centre very much at that nexus between climate, development finance, humanitarian finance. And I think with the number of different key processes that have happened this year, everything from Bridgetown and the real kind of emphasis on reforming climate and development finance access, to the SDG stocktake, to to the COP stock take as well, that we try and ensure that these threads are really brought together and that we don't sort of have climate development, risk finance and insurance going off in one direction, humanitarian anticipatory action discussions going off on one direction. Because if you're a ministry in a country, in a low-income country, you're really looking for kind of a consolidated set of policies and guidelines and incentives and investment here. And these really do collectively set a blueprint for investment and action for future years. And I think we've really seen them come together, particularly at the start of this week or the start of this COP with the real historic announcement on the loss and damage finance facility. 14 months ago we didn't really think that this was going to be a thing and happen, and now we're really seeing some clear agreements, and then the kind of complementary pieces as well with the launch of the Global Shield against climate risks. And I know that was a big focus of discussions earlier today as well. But I think it's really key that we try and kind of bring these all together and ensure, we've seen some really big commitments, particularly to the new fund. But I think many of us will already be thinking like, okay, we're looking at replenishment in how many years? Because actually the need for the size of the payouts required for those who are really on the front lines of extreme weather, of climate crisis, and closing that protection gap is really key. So I think ensuring that the momentum that we've seen this year continues, and you don't see the intergovernmental processes, the international community, us policy wonks kind of wave off and be like, oh, we did that last year. Okay, what's the focus next? And seeing that continued join up is going to be really critical.
So, we've talked, Christina shared examples as well as, Leslie, of very tangible initiatives. But as we look to, again, address this space, what are some of the elements that we really need to pay attention to? Because Lydia started to touch on that in terms of, and you've mentioned its scale, but also quality, right? What does quality mean in this context, given the work that you're also, you've been doing with the center around this?
So I think it's the less sexy stuff, really digging into ensuring that you have the monitoring of the data, that you have the transparency of the data, so that you really can be focused on high quality initiatives and be frank about where the limitations are and where prearranged financing is currently falling short. I know that you and I and many of us have talked around setting ambitious targets, but at the same time there's not necessarily a target that fits all. So how can us at the centre work with different partners to think, okay, how do we take this agenda from really kind of good to great, scale up where we're seeing at the moment those kind of islands of effectiveness, and share key lessons learned, but also in terms of the monitoring and implementation of all of the different targets that come with a lot of these different intergovernmental processes as well. I think it can be compelling to try and think about, moving to the next issue rather than thinking, okay, actually a lot of this is actually threaded through, be it through the current climate agreement, be it through the SDGs, particularly SDG 1.5, which is my favorite and always gets overlooked, which is about building crisis resilience for people. And how do we actually hold all of ourselves collectively to account for what's already there and agreed, rather than sort of shooting off in different directions.
Okay, thank you very much, Eleanor. I would like to now open the floor for questions. As I said, I know there are quite a few people that have been involved in putting into operation some of these mechanisms. You know the ins and outs, you know their limitations and strengths. So any questions from the audience, or is just perfectly clear and perfectly fine? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Konstantin Klammert. I'm the desk officer for anticipatory action at the German Federal Foreign Office. I'm just, we keep hearing about the need for coordination, and it's, absolutely clear, especially now with the Loss and Damage Fund or new financing for loss and damage, maybe also supporting pre-arranged financing, be it anticipatory action, be it other, initiatives like the ARC through the Global Shield. And, I'm just wondering, what are your practical, advices, for how that coordination can work? Is it on a country level? Just practically, when and how do we coordinate all these different financing flows, to make sure that they're actually used effectively? Because we do hear a lot about coordination, but I just can't really imagine how that coordination works, and I'd be really grateful if you have any insights. Thank you.
Maybe I take that.
Leslie.
Maybe I'll start while my fellow panelists think of something more insightful to say. In my view, right, it always starts at the national government level. I think the role of the government needs to be really emphasized in this instance. So what we are seeing on the African continent is that more and more countries are developing national disaster risk management and financing strategies. And once you have that as a framework, you can then decide what level of disasters can be financed from budgetary allocation, what needs to be transferred via insurance, what needs much greater firepower like a catastrophe bond or a CAT or a CAT DDO. Then I think once you approach it like that, then it becomes a lot clearer where the various financing instruments fit in. Then there's also coordination at the level of the response. You know, once a disaster has happened, you want everyone that's been affected to have at least equal access to the funding that's available. And again, that's a role for the national government to play. Then maybe the last level of coordination that I'll mention that is required is actually at the donor level. We're enormously grateful to the financial support that they provide, et cetera. And my comments shouldn't be taken to mean otherwise. But then every donor that's coming in wants to finance a specific pilot in a remote part of the country with their own reporting requirements. So what would be really helpful, I think, is to start to leverage global vehicles like the Global Shield, which is being supported by the German government, among others, so that we can at least have one uniform standard in terms of the requirements, and agents like ourselves and like the humanitarian agencies can really focus on implementing the solution and not answering to RFP number 365.
So maybe just quickly, I'll pick up on that. So in terms of coordination, I see a few avenues for that. And of course, the first coordination should be around finance. And you know, we've been sort of banging this drum for a long time about impact before instruments. So as a government, as a donor, before thinking about which funding mechanisms and channels and tools you're going to use, think about the impact that you want to see, and then come around which funding streams and tools really solve that impact, and hopefully as locally and as community-based as it could be. I wonder if this is a new nexus, dare I mention the word, but climate, you know, humanitarian development and climate, I think we've got a real opportunity here to define in practical terms what that nexus could look like. But I spoke about earlier, and I feel very strongly about this as a membership, that we really need to coordinate better across actors, right? So whether it's the UN, INGOs, local NGOs, communities, local government, we all need to be in country, getting around the table, really identifying risks, viewing them in similar ways, maybe not the same way, but in similar risks, and then really coming together around planning. Because if we can bring the local governments, communities, and all of the aid actors in between into contingency planning around these risk models, then I think we get to this idea of complementarity in our efforts and not duplication. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina, for that. Okay.
I just want to continue on my IDF advertiser marketing campaign here, because you know, if we wait till the national level, I think in some cases it's too late to coordinate. So I think models like the tripartite model that the IDF operates are critical, where you're bringing key actors in to kind of look at things on a global level, where the capabilities are, where the strengths are, where there are gaps, and then you go into national implementation. So there has to be a level above it. I think this is the difference. Leslie is actually implementing complex programs. So of course it starts and ends almost at a national level. But I do think if you're looking at something like the massive nature and the global nature of Global Shield, then you do need the kind of partnerships, the multi-stakeholder partnerships that are going to, as you said, kind of bring those capabilities together and then apply them where it's needed.
Yeah. So thank you, Francis, for that. So it's bring those capabilities to serve the objective of the impact that the states and the actors on the ground also want to see, right? So that's also at the heart of this. But I wonder if there are any other questions in the room. Yes, I see one more.
Thank you. My name is Fatono Ayola from Nigeria. I work for Legal Assurance Company Limited. My question is specifically to Leslie. I would want to know, in arranging these meso contracts for catastrophic losses, how do you guys go around the issue of data challenges for whom these payouts are supposed to go to, so that at the end of the day, they trickle down to the vulnerable households who actually needs the payout? Right. How have you guys been able to handle that in arranging those meso contracts? Thank you.
So I guess I have to answer it.
Yes.
So actually, you've touched on a very important point, because when we provide, I think for the benefit of everyone in the room, parametric insurance. So the level of claim to be paid is determined by a model, and the model runs on data. And again, as everyone will appreciate, right, it's garbage in, garbage out. But in our case, it's really important that we get the calibration of the claim right, because we don't want to undermine the confidence that clients have in the accuracy of the models and what we are producing. Also, when it comes to data, it's been an evolution. When you look at the quality of the data that we have now versus the data that we had 10 years ago, I think there's been a significant improvement. It's not yet perfect, but I think it's getting much better. Then if you look at it, say, at the national level or over a very large area, it's easier to be within the ballpark from an average standpoint. So for us who are running national insurance schemes, then the problem is a lot easier to solve. Where it becomes really complicated is when you're insuring individual smallholder farmers, because you need to be able to determine what the size of the claim is almost at the farm level. And for that, there is some technology that's come up. So there is now satellite data that you can get almost on a 100 meters by 100 meters level with some degree of accuracy. This can also be supplemented by crop cuts, so where you have assessors that are on the ground who can then take a sample of crop yields, and then you're able to cross-reference this localized data with the more macro satellite data. But then also the satellite technology also improves significantly, I think, on a year-to-year basis. So again, not fully solved. We've found some workarounds, but it does get better with time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Leslie, for that. There is another element, I think, to your point around how do you reach the most affected. So one of the elements, I think, that is also quite innovative about our ARC program is the link to contingency plans. So working with governments to predefine where are those vulnerable communities, so that when the financing is triggered, it actually gets to those communities and gets to them on time. So that's also part of the conversation that we're having here today, right? It's not only about the triggering of the financing on time, it's also making sure that those resources get to the people on time. Otherwise, we don't really have an impact, right? So I just wanted to add that additional point. I see quite a few of our members who are also involved. I see some additional hands, but due to time, I'm not sure I can take any more. Okay, 10 seconds. 10 seconds?
I don't know if I can make it in 10 seconds, but let me go quick.
Okay.
The issue of parametric insurance, very interesting. Yeah. It has been on a pilot mode since 2005. It has not gone commercial up to now. There has been a lot of pressure to move it to the commercial element. It's not moving there because there's a lot of public good element in parametric insurance. Now, when the partners come in and I don't want to use the word subsidy, but it's a PPP. And there are those people who call it subsidy and they make it a very bad name because they call it subsidy. Parametric insurance may not go fully commercial. It has to have that public-private partnership for it to work. That's what we are seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, if we call it subsidy, we give it a bad name.
So you have introduced a very interesting point, but we do not have the time to delve into that. That is an entire session on its own. So we will table that for, I don't know, the next COP or another event. But it's a very good point that I think, is also part of the discussion of how do you actually provide products that meet the needs of the most vulnerable and in some instances cannot afford, right? And so what do those solutions need to look like? And some of the initiatives that have been referenced today are parametric insurance products, but we've not had the time to necessarily delve into that. And so with that, I would now like to thank our speakers for their contribution. I think that it was an excellent session in terms of the depth of the study, the nuance and the complexity of this situation that we are dealing the situation that we are dealing with, but also the fact that there are experiences with implementation. And so it's also an opportunity for us to think carefully about how we scale these, build on these, innovate within this space. And to conclude, I would just like to flag that as the IDF, we're also, with our partners, the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, actually launching a call to action tomorrow morning in the Blue Zone. I can't remember the specific location. We'll share details. But it's, again, a call to action to flag this as an issue, but also to encourage all of us to do better. Governments, humanitarian institutions, public sector, etc., we can do better. So I encourage you to engage with that. You can ask any of the colleagues from REAP to find out more about it, or any of the colleagues within the IDF as well to find out more about it. But I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining the session, listening, and let's move this forward. Let's address this issue that's not acceptable. Thank you.